Was Robert Menzies Australia's greatest Prime Minister? After all, he was the longest-serving leader in Australian history, with 7 election victories and 18 years in power. He became the architect of modern conservative Australia. To some Australians, he was the man who built the middle-class dream: cheap homes, stable jobs, economic growth, and national confidence. To others, he represented an outdated Australia, through racial exclusion, rigid conservatism, fear of communism, and resistance to social change. So, who was the real Robert Menzies? Was he a political genius, a nation builder, or simply a man lucky enough to govern during the greatest economic boom in modern history? In this video, we're diving into the legacy of the man many liberals still call the Forgotten People's Prime Minister, and by the end, you can decide, was he Australia's greatest leader, or just its most successful politician? Robert Gordon Menzies served as Prime Minister for over 18 years. That's longer than any other Australian leader. And unlike many leaders who limp across the finish line, Menzies kept winning, again, and again, and again, culminating in 7 consecutive election victories, a feat unsurpassed even today. Now, that level of political dominance doesn't happen by accident. Essentially, Menzies understood something crucial: that most Australians didn't see themselves as rich elites, but they also didn't see themselves as revolutionaries. They were what he famously called the forgotten people, the middle class. Small business owners, teachers, office workers, tradesmen, suburban families, people who wanted stability, security, and a decent life. Menzies built an entire political movement around them. In many ways, modern Australian conservatism still operates using the blueprint he created in the 1940s and 50s. Under his leadership, Australia became extraordinarily prosperous. This was the era of booming manufacturing, rising wages, mass home ownership, cheap university education, and near full employment. In the 1950s and early 60s, unemployment was often below 2%. Imagine telling modern Australians that governments once worried unemployment was too low. Today economists would probably faint from excitement. For millions of Australians, this became the age of the quarter-acre block, the Hills Hoist, the family Holden, and annual holidays at the beach. Australia genuinely became one of the richest societies on Earth. But here's the important question: was this because of Menzies, or because the entire Western world was booming after World War II? And honestly, the answer is probably both. The global economy was exploding thanks to post-war reconstruction, cheap energy, booming population growth, and American economic dominance. But leadership still mattered. Menzies provided political stability during a time when many countries were experiencing chaos. And stability creates confidence. Confidence creates investment. And investment creates growth. That's one reason his supporters argue he helped create modern middle-class Australia. Oddly enough, one of Menzies' greatest achievements came in education, which surprises people, because he's often remembered as a conservative traditionalist. But Menzies absolutely loved universities. He saw higher education as essential for building a serious nation. In the 1950s, his government massively expanded federal funding for universities. Scholarships increased, research funding grew, and campuses expanded. Before this period, universities were mostly for elites. After Menzies, they slowly became accessible to the broader middle class. Modern Australia's scientific and professional workforce owes a lot to these reforms. Ironically, many Australians who later became anti-Menzies intellectuals probably studied at universities he helped fund. That's political irony at its finest. But this is where the story becomes more complicated. Menzies governed a very different Australia from today, an Australia that was overwhelmingly white, socially conservative, deeply tied to Britain, and terrified of communism. This was the era of the White Australia policy. Indigenous Australians still faced severe discrimination and exclusion. Women were often expected to leave work after marriage. Television censorship was strict. And politically, anti-communism rhetoric dominated everything. Menzies became obsessed with the communist threat during the Cold War. In 1950, he even tried to ban the Communist Party outright, but the High Court struck it down. Then, Australians narrowly rejected the proposal in a referendum. Now, to modern audiences, banning political parties sounds extreme, but context matters. At the time, China had just become communist, the Soviet Union had nuclear weapons, and the Korean War had erupted. People genuinely feared global communist expansion. Still, critics argue Menzies used fear very effectively politically. And honestly, they're probably right. Few politicians in Australian history weaponized anti-communism more successfully than Menzies. Menzies also pushed Australia firmly into the American alliance. Today, Australia's relationship with the United States feels almost automatic, but that wasn't always true. Before World War II, Australia depended primarily on Britain. Menzies governed during the collapse of the British Empire, and he realised something many older Australians struggled to accept, that Britain could no longer protect Australia. So, he pivoted toward the United States. That led to the ANZUS alliance in 1951, one of the most important strategic decisions in Australian history. But this alliance also drew Australia into Vietnam. Menzies introduced conscription and committed Australian troops to the Vietnam War. Supporters argued this protected Australia from communist expansion in Asia. Critics saw it as blindly following America into a disastrous conflict, and history remains deeply divided on that decision. Now, here's the real debate among historians. Was Menzies truly Australia's greatest Prime Minister, or simply the luckiest? Because unlike leaders such as Curtin during World War II, Whitlam during social upheaval, or Hawke during economic restructuring, Menzies governed during relatively stable and prosperous times. Commodity prices were strong. The population was booming. And industry was expanding. Australia had favourable winds behind it that propelled it to prosperity. So maybe, Menzies wasn't a genius. Maybe, he was simply surfing the biggest economic wave in modern history. But critics sometimes underestimate how difficult long-term political stability actually is. Many countries had economic booms after the war, but not all of them produced stable democracies. Not all avoided political extremism. And not all maintained social cohesion. Fortunately, Australia did. And Menzies deserves at least some credit for that. So, was Robert Menzies Australia's greatest Prime Minister? If greatness means electoral success, political dominance, economic stability, and institutional legacy, then yes, he has perhaps the strongest claim in Australian history. But if greatness means moral courage, social transformation, Indigenous justice, or visionary reform, then the picture becomes far murkier. Menzies built a stable and prosperous Australia. But it was also a narrow Australia, a cautious Australia, an Australia deeply tied to old British traditions and Cold War fears. In many ways, modern Australia was built both because of Menzies, and later in reaction against him. And perhaps that's the clearest sign of his importance. Even today, Australian politics still lives in the shadow of Robert Menzies. But what do you think? Was Menzies Australia's greatest Prime Minister? Let me know in the comments below. And if you enjoyed this video, make sure to like, subscribe, and hit the bell so you don't miss future deep dives into history, politics, and the ideas that shape the modern world. Thanks for watching.